Upon taking the throne in 1952, Queen Elizabeth II inherited millions of subjects around the world, many of them unwilling. Today, in the British Empire's former colonies, her death brings complicated feelings, including anger. Elizabeth's reign saw the hard-won independence of African countries beyond official condolences praising the Queen's longevity and service. There is some bitterness about the past in Africa, as well as Asia, the Caribbean, and elsewhere. That's our focus on World of Africa today. Welcome to the program with me, Erik Njoka. The White House has welcomed a statement by forces in northern Ethiopia's Tigray region that they would accept an African Union-led peace process. Tigray has set up a negotiation team that is ready to be deployed without delay. The Ethiopian federal government said in June that the African Union should facilitate peace talks. William Samoei Ruto has been inaugurated as Kenya's 5th president in a ceremony attended by dozens of global leaders and diplomats. A peaceful handover of power following a bitter election season that underscored the place of democracy in East Africa's largest economy. Burkina Faso's military leader, Colonel Paul Henry Damiba, has taken over the defense portfolio in the West African nation, struggling with an ongoing extremist insurgency. Damiba seized power in January, citing the previous government's inability to tackle the country's problems, including the insurgency that killed thousands and displaced more than 2 million, including in neighboring Mali and Niger. It was in South Africa that the royals first stepped foot on the continent. And on her 21st birthday in 1947, young Princess Elizabeth gave a speech in Cape Town that set off her reign and marked her heiress journey to inherit the father. I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service, she said. In the years to follow, the Queen returned to Africa and even created a special bond with Nelson Madiba Mandela. Here's a report from Kalden Ongmu.
Heartfelt condolences have been pouring in from all over the world for Queen Elizabeth II, including South Africa, a country with which the monarchy had strong ties rich with history. The late Queen made her first visit to the country with her parents and sister in the year 1947. On her 21st birthday, Princess Elizabeth made a speech broadcast from the gardens of Government House in Cape Town.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong.
Considering the history of colonialism in Africa, which was at times a bit complicated, the royal family was treated with kind and respect. Princess Elizabeth in her speech even emphasized that everywhere she traveled in South Africa with her parents and sister, she felt she was at home. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa joined hands with the world in sending condolences to the Britain's royal family. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II passed away on Thursday at the age of 96 years. Queen Elizabeth shared a strong bond with South Africa, and more so with former President Nelson Mandela. It is said they enjoyed a warm friendship and highly respected each other. They were friendly and often hosted one another in their respective countries. Mandela apparently even had a special name for her.
Queen and Madiba had a very special relationship. This relationship went as far as him referring to her on a first-name basis and vice versa. And that kind of closeness, you do not just write off because a person, both of them has now passed on. To demonstrate this closeness, Madiba also just fondly referred to her as Motlalepule, which in a local South African language means the one who brings rain. This was after Queen Elizabeth had visited Madiba in 1995, and it rained so heavily that Madiba appreciated the rain, that she was here when it was raining.
However, not every South African was a fan of the late Queen, and after her passing, this was made clear. South Africa's third largest political party, the Economic Freedom Fighters, issued a statement where they mentioned, "We do not mourn the passing of Elizabeth because to us, her death is a reminder of a very tragic period in the country and Africa's history. During her 70-year reign as queen, she never once acknowledged the atrocities that her family inflicted on native people that Britain invaded across the world. If there is really life and justice after death, may Elizabeth and her ancestors get what they deserve." But there is a new line of royalty and monarch. Some in the continent are optimistic about the new king's era. They say leaders in some countries in the continent need to up their game.
The past happened. What about the now and the future? And so I think that is the most important thing. And so I understand that in the African discourse and even in the African academia, philosophy, intellectualism, it's always good to use the historical analysis, because that's where you sound intellectual and revolutionary. But when you say, okay, fine, now let's talk about the future, that's where you find that we are bankrupt and we are naked. And so that's why I'm saying, let's have futuristic revolutionaries, people who would really redefine the future of Africa rather than to be the prison of sentimental politics.
The fallen queen was connected to Africa in so many ways, but her passion for the continent was clouded by deeds of the past, like oppression by the British colonialists in their now former territories. The queen did try to foster relationship during her visits to Africa. However, most praised the crown and not the person who wore it. This is Kalden Ongmo from Johannesburg, South Africa, for WION World is One.
In 1952, Princess Elizabeth and her husband Philip set off for a whirlwind tour of the Commonwealth. They made a stopover in Kenya, and a hotel that they boarded during their stay became world famous. It was the same year that King George VI died and Elizabeth was proclaimed queen, while still on the African soil. This is a story of Treetops Hotel in Kenya and how they remember their most royal guest.
January 1952, the princess and her husband were seen off by the king, too ill with lung cancer to make the tour himself. The crowd gave him a sympathetic cheer as he stood in the bitter cold to say goodbye to his daughter.
Sad homecoming of a young queen. The Atalanta was punctual, and bearing a message from the Queen Mother, the Duke of Gloucester.
3 days after they arrived, the royal couple travelled up country to Sagana, and from there they drove after lunch.
With perfect composure, she greeted the Prime Minister and all who had come to meet her. Her Majesty graciously thanked the crew of the Atalanta.
On the 5th of February, to Treetops, the game viewing lodge built on a tree overlooking an elephant waterhole. They planned to spend the night watching wildlife, enjoying a respite from their duties before continuing the rest of their tour.
Were due to be spent before sailing to Australia. The grievous news of her father's death.
Treetops is old hat now, but in 1952 it was the only place of its kind in the world. While the princess was at Treetops on the night her father, George VI, died on the 6th of February 1952, she was not told until the following afternoon. She was proclaimed queen the same day. This is Treetops today. The lodge, although closed due to COVID, still holds her passing to heart because her stay put the establishment on the world map.
It is very sad when we heard the news that she has passed on, because she left a big legacy in this hotel, because most of the tourists who normally visit here in Africa, they don't complete their journey without coming to Treetops and see where Queen Elizabeth visited. And normally they want to see even the Queen's room, because it still exists. And it is like a monument.
Amos Ndegwa is a naturalist and tour guide at the Treetops Lodge. He is walking through the grounds, the same path the royals took as they were ascending to the lodge. Ndegwa walks through the lobby to the desk and lights candles.
We are writing these candles to join the whole world on mourning Queen Elizabeth II, who passed on yesterday around midday.
Elizabeth and Philip were in the original hotel of only 2 rooms when she heard the news. It was a 2-bedroom treehouse in an African fig tree, reachable only by a very long ladder, and built next to a watering hole which attracted wildlife like elephants, buffalo and rhino. The idea was to encourage big game hunters to photograph wildlife rather than shoot the animals. The original structure was burned down, but the hotel was rebuilt with 35 rooms near the same waterhole and became fashionable for the rich and famous. But Treetops remains in the glories of the past, and times have changed. The hotel now fallen on hard times since COVID pandemic and global recession.
Most of our staff are still raided at home because of the pandemic, which was struck from 2019. And because of the world recession, we are raided down and the business is too low.
When Elizabeth visited in 1952, no photographers or journalists were allowed to accompany her. So the only pictures of her at Treetops were taken over 30 years later on a follow-up visit in 1983. After their escapades in Africa that were cut short following King George's demise, Elizabeth returned to London as Queen and Philip as the Duke of Edinburgh. It was to be the beginning of Her Majesty's long reign at the helm of the British Crown.
Elizabeth's reign saw the hard-won independence of African countries from Ghana to Zimbabwe, along with a string of Caribbean islands and nations along the edge of the Arabian Peninsula. Some historians see her as a monarch who helped oversee the mostly peaceful transition from empire to the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of 56 nations with historic and linguistic ties. She was also the symbol of a nation that often rode roughshod over people it subjugated. Here's a story about the Mau Mau's long-fraught relationship with the monarch, and we also speak to an expert on why the wounds of the past cannot be erased so easily.
As condolences pour in, there are mixed feelings in Kenya and among some other Africans about the late Queen Elizabeth and her country's colonial legacy. Britain once ruled more than half of Africa. Many have fond memories of its longest-serving monarch, who smiled and waved at crowds in 20 countries across the continent during her 70-year reign. But others remember colonial times, like the brutal 1950s crushing of Kenya's Mau Mau rebellion as the sun set on Britain's empire. 98-year-old Kenyan Gitu Wakahengeri was 17 when he joined the rebellion against British rule. He says he mourns Elizabeth as a human being, but won't forget being detained in a camp by British forces, beaten and denied food. They occupied my land, my birthright, he says.
I am not a believer of forgetting. Therefore, we will say, okay, you did what you did. You have said you have written an apology, a regret letter. If you want to apologize in the future, you can do so. But we will not forget, I personally will not forget that I was incarcerated for 7 years. I cannot forget I was put together with my father. I cannot forget I left my children for 7 years without food, without education. That I will never forget.
The tragic news reached Princess Elizabeth and her husband while in...
Elizabeth was on a visit to Kenya, aged 25, with her husband Philip, when she learned of the death of her father, King George IV, and her accession to the throne in 1952.
Gloucester entered the plane.
She was to return many times to Africa as Queen. Kenyan cartoonist Patrick Gathara encouraged people not to forget Britain's colonial past.
There's a tendency by some to sort of say, well, the past is the past, just ignore it. It's a nice old lady who has passed. But I'm also encouraged by the fact that there's quite, especially online, quite a vocal a number of people who are refusing to be taken in by this. We're insisting that no, the history has to be told as it is. We've got to remember it as it is, and especially now when all these tributes are flowing, when all the when the fundamentals of that history are being laid down, that we don't accept to be erased any longer, that our stories have to be included in there, the good along with the bad.
King Charles's accession to the throne has also stirred renewed calls from politicians and activists in former colonies in the Caribbean to remove the monarch as their head of state, and for Britain to pay reparations for slavery.
Africans, Kenyans, the Agikuyu, Embu and Meru suffered under the shepherd head while the queen was at the front, because she was like the head of state of Kenya, of the Kenya colony, because what we had here was just a governor. So they have no reason to celebrate because she saw they are suffering. The white administration had a way to maneuver through, and it is by so doing that they termed the freedom fighters as Mau Mau. Those who went to the forest to fight for their freedom, their independence, and their land were not Mau Mau. They were Kenya Land Freedom Army, KLFA. But the administration had to create an image of people who are backward and civilized, and that's how they came with the word Mau Mau, which they have an array of description of how Mau Mau were backward, of how Mau Mau took off using even menstrual blood. There are historians, white historians, who have alluded to that. So it was a misnomer to call Kenya Lands Freedom Army Mau Mau. There is hope. I can say there is hope, because I suppose King Charles III will see it into himself to compensate Kenyans. Remember, King Charles was here in 1971 together with Princess Annie. They spent their time here for 2 weeks. So he has something to compensate. He has every reason that his mother was coronated here in Kenya. He has every reason to give back, or even to wipe tears of these Kenyans. With abolishment of the monarch, I believe it will be scrapping of the evidence, because they were at the center, they were epicenter of all atrocities that Africans were meted. So if we do away with the monarch, there will be no one to hold accountable. But as long as the monarch is in place, we have someone to take to court. We have someone to claim, to ask for compensation. So let the monarch be. When the monarch is there, it's good for Africans.
There are few signs of public grief or even interest in her death across Africa, where many still hold Britain responsible for colonial actions that drew much of the region's borders and laid the groundwork for many of its modern conflicts. there is a lingering spiritual connection in some African countries from the colonial experience to the Commonwealth. It is a moment of pain and a moment of nostalgia for the countries which still belong to the Commonwealth. Here now is a report.
This is 96-year-old Louise Murray. She's fond of telling stories to her family members. Known by her friends and family as the Queen of Brixton, the great and great-grandmother who has fostered more than 20 children, shares something unique with the late monarch.
They call you the Queen of Brixton, yes, I hear.
Yes. When I had birthday comes up at that time, I said, it is the Queen's birthday and for me too. So I'm feeling good.
Mare, who left her native Jamaica for the United Kingdom as part of the Windrush generation, saw the Queen in the flesh when she visited Jamaica with Prince Philip on a royal tour of the Commonwealth.
We wave to everyone, and we wave back.
Bilal Omar, a Brixton shop manager originally from India, said watching the Queen from a young age inspired him to want to move to the United Kingdom almost 20 years ago.
We always heard about the news like Queen, sometimes picture come in on the newspaper, what's he done.
Michael Boateng, who was raised in Ghana, feels the Queen's legacy will live on through King Charles III.
She's a very strong brand. Now we've got a king, he might probably follow the same footsteps that the mum left behind.
She sort of made everyone feel like part of the Commonwealth, part of Britain, you know, so I just think like the world's a poorer place without her.
The Commonwealth has gone through its fair share of political crises over the years, including Barbados removing Queen Elizabeth II as its head of state and becoming a republic. So it is unclear what will happen now. Member states have expressed dissatisfaction with the ceremonial head at the helm when there is an elected Secretary General responsible for its representation.
I don't think so. I think the Commonwealth is very useful. It is one of the few clubs where you communicate in one language without translations. And the members have a lot of links, social links, historical links, links through religion, the Christian religion. It can actually be used more, in my opinion. In our opinion, we think we can use it more.
Some may therefore choose to end their union with Britain, now that the Queen has passed away. What happens is mainly dependent on who is in power in the relevant nations and what they would prefer to do.
As condolences poured in from around the world after Queen Elizabeth II's death, a popular Cape Town bakery added some color to the tributes by baking petite fours and cookies to commemorate her life. The cupcakes were decorated with tribute messages written in the colors of the Union flag, red, white, and blue. We leave you with this report from South Africa. Thank you very much for watching this week's edition of World of Africa. Bye-bye.